bit late on Roy. Well, I'd like to start by thanking everyone, of course, for choosing this, obviously the best breakout group. So congratulations on your excellent taste. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're all meeting on the stolen lands of the First Nations. I myself am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. As I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about rebuilding our manufacturing capacity. We'll talk a little bit about industry policy and what it might look like in 21st century Australia, particularly coming out of this crisis. We're joined by Emeritus Professor Roy Green from UTS, who's one of the leading figures of industrial policy in the academic and in the practical applications of it. We've got Gemma Beale, who is a PhD candidate at Flinders University. And we've got Andrew Dedman, who is the National President of the ANWU. But before we get on to our excellent speakers, I'll just do a little bit of framing for us and hopefully talk about something that some of the others might not be covering. Before we do get on to that, I will ask you all to keep your audio muted. We've actually only got a few people, so feel free to keep your video on. It was only if we were going to have hundreds and hundreds of people flooding into these sessions that we'd be asking you to keep your videos off, but that's fine. Make sure that your screen is set to speaker view so that you will get to see our fantastic speakers when they are speaking. And make sure you type your questions into the Q&A section and put video at the start of the question if you would like to ask it yourself. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask on behalf of you if you're not comfortable sharing your screen and your voice. And finally, of course, no racist, sexist, homophobic or other offensive content will be tolerated. I doubt we'll have that here, but just letting everybody know that if today was the day that you were going to go on a hate rant, it's probably not the best place for it. So when we think about our manufacturing capacity, there's been a number of things that have happened in our history. And most importantly, we need to realize that it is one part of our economy that is susceptible to other parts of the economy. And external crises have always had major impacts on our manufacturing capacity, whether it's resource crises like the oil shock of the 1970s or a pandemic like the coronavirus crisis that swept the world in 2020. We know that globally integrated open market economies like ours are inherently susceptible to these externalities these days. However, I would argue that these exogenous shocks are also a time for reflection and renewal. We're really standing at a crossroads where we can decide what our economy should look like going forward. Down one path is a continued belief in Australia's embedded globalisation and that we should be looking for the lowest price point in any particular industry. And believe that we're going to just snap back and perform just the way that we have before. And down the other is a sober realization that we can't really keep relying on external capacities in this space, and that we do have the capabilities to rebuild and address our lack of manufacturing that we currently face. So as the current crisis has laid bare the deficiencies in our economy, it's up to all of us to decide how we rebuild our economy. Australia's industrial landscape has undergone many changes in the century since federation has become a modern globalised economy, as I was talking about earlier. It's made us open to export and trade with key regional and international partners. Yet despite the promise that this brave new world of economic opportunity would lead to prosperity for all, instead Australia's economy has become increasingly crisis prone and failed to provide safe and secure livelihoods for millions of Australians, which we know that we are able to do and we have done before. Arguably, an over-reliance on mineral commodities and services has led to a situation where the Australian economy and the people who work in it are remarkably susceptible to these sorts of shocks. This reliance became most pronounced at around about the turn of this last century. Between 2002 and 2012, the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, estimates that the price paid for Australia's extractive economy more than tripled as investments in the sector grew from 2% to 8% of GDP. However, while prices in mining grew significantly, the dollar appreciated significantly, and an increase in the value of the dollar had some benefits for the average consumer, as the price of imported goods like smartphones and electronics and some fashion goods dropped. However, our currency also hindered our agriculture and manufacturing sectors. And while jobs in mining peaked at about 2.3% of the Australian workforce in 2013, 2014, manufacturing and agriculture used to employ a quarter of the Australian workforce. Since the start of the mining boom, this combined employment has fallen to just 15%. Australia's economy is not only plagued by this, what's called the Dutch disease or the resource curse, where the increased development of one particular industry like mining has led to a decline in other important industries like manufacturing. It has become so lopsided that it is making headlines around the world. In the recently publicised Atlas of Economic Complexity, Harvard University found that despite being ranked 8th in the world for GDP per capita, Australia's economic profile was ranked about 93rd in economic complexity. So rather than being compared to the complex and innovative economies like Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia is instead keeping economic company with the developing economies in Uganda, Senegal, and Mali. And what makes matters worse is that we are falling in those rankings. Since the time of the GFC, Australia's economic complexity has fallen by 22 positions. That means that without diversification and a rebuilding of our manufacturing sector, which we know produces so many other economic benefits, we will continue to decline and be more susceptible to these sorts of crises. Now, hopefully all our speakers are here now. Roy, are you in the chat? Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Well, we might just throw to you. And hold on, I'll try and take us off screen share so that everyone can see you. There we go.
Okay, well, thanks, Shelley. I missed the first part of what you said there. You might have covered something I'm about to say. I'm very used to putting industrial strategy on a page, less so on a postage stamp, but I'll have a good go at it. Effectively, as you say, manufacturing was around a quarter, 30% of our GDP in the 1970s. With the tariff reductions of the 80s and 90s, manufacturing took a hit, but it also was repositioning because we're moving from mass production systems to more flexible specialization, and hence units of production are getting smaller, albeit more interdependent in a globalized economy. And the second big hit was the commodity boom of the early 2000s. It was great for consumers, added 15% to our standard of living over a 6-year period. But what it did was make our manufacturing uncompetitive. And you referenced the Dutch disease, which was the gas discoveries of the 1970s in Holland. Similar thing happened in Britain with North Sea oil at the end of their consumption boom in the 1970s. They were left with a few people driving BMWs, but all of their hospitals and schools in a state of decay due to the starvation from public resources and a moribund manufacturing industry from which they've tried to claw back. Really only Norway understood how to do this, and they took a public stake in their North Sea oil and gas assets. They imposed not a 20% resource rent tax, but a 76% resource rent tax. And they used that to build the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, over $1 trillion, which is now investing in their research and innovation future. Did we learn from that? Well, that's a rhetorical question, because if we had, we wouldn't be where we are now, with manufacturing down to 6% of GDP. Is that a problem? Well, a lot of economists, orthodox economists, thought that's fine. That's just part of a structural adjustment. We're going to become a post-industrial service-based economy. But the problem is what we have now is first world living standards that are funded by massive exports of unprocessed raw materials, supporting, but based on effectively a third world industrial structure. And that's what you highlighted with the reference to the complexity index. The COVID crisis has been a wake-up call. It's exposed all the gaps in our manufacturing supply chains, but the complexity index is an more important kind of overarching problem for us, because what it shows is that we lack the ability to export research intensive and more diverse products. Our export mix is so heavily dominated by unprocessed raw materials. And that's where we start from. So how can we address it? We could say we wouldn't want to start from here because our R&D is now down to 1.7% of GDP from 2.2% a few years ago. OECD average is around 2.4%. Most countries, most advanced economies, which are going to more successfully rebound from this crisis, are looking at a percentage of 3% or more. Switzerland, Germany, Korea. These are the countries to which we should be comparing ourselves, and they're basing their very large manufacturing sectors, around 15 to 20% of GDP, not on low-cost competition, but on competitive advantage based on quality, on design, on innovation. So in my 5 minutes, 5 quick points that I've been making to the Liveris Manufacturing Task Force set up by the government to look at this. Firstly, we do need a central agency to set priorities, to define national missions, to set the path forward for manufacturing, as happens in many other countries. And we here set up something called Innovation and Science Australia. It turned out to be a damn squib. It was supposed to be just such an agency like Innovate UK or Enterprise Ireland or TechEd in Finland. We need something to do a foresighting study of where our competitive advantages lie and where they will lie in the future. That's number one. And we'll see what they come up with in this task force. Second is to enhance our collaboration between business and research organisations, and this in the context of the national missions, which also include and must include the climate change crisis, and manufacturing will play a big part in the move to a low emissions economy if we do that right, especially in the context of our access to massive resources of sunshine and wind transmitted through water electrolysis and then hydrogen, as documented by Ross Garno in his excellent superpower book for Australia, us as an energy superpower, not just to export sunshine, which we can certainly do in the form of ammonia, but also to use it to reboot our manufacturing sector. And the Grattan Institute has come up recently via Tony Wood with this excellent proposition around green steel, which is entirely feasible and which no one up till now, apart from Sanjeev Gupta, who runs part of our steel industry, has been thinking about. Thirdly, startup sector. We don't really think of the startup sector in the context of manufacturing usually, but we should. Most of our young people think startups are an app on a smartphone, think products are an app on a smartphone. We need everyone to think in terms of products that they make. Why don't we set up networks of maker spaces so that people can prototype new manufacturing products and link that to research organizations as well. Fourthly, public procurement. That's always been a massive issue. The orthodox approach is let's pursue value for money, which means we offshore large sections of our manufacturing that could be supplying products to public procurement programs, as well as to large infrastructure and mining projects through local participation schemes. Other countries like the US have public procurement programs such as the SBIR, Small Business Innovation and Research Program, which allocate a small percentage of funding by public organisations to local capability building and contracts for SMEs so that they can then grow and become global players in their own right in global markets and value chains. We're only just starting to think about that, and some of the states are doing it, but not at the Commonwealth level. And that really just highlights another issue for us, the fragmentation and duplication of programs between Commonwealth and states that needs to be addressed. Finally, skills, well, that's an obvious one, and we've seen the partial collapse of our vocational education and training sector thanks to market contestability around TAFE. That needs to be addressed, and it needs to be more integrated with our university education system, which itself faces its own crisis with the collapse of international student revenues. What most politicians are refusing to acknowledge is that these international student revenues, which are there because of cuts to public funding for universities over several decades, not only prop up domestic teaching, they prop up the university research function. And if they want universities and researchers to contribute not only to COVID recovery, but to the restructuring of our economy, then to allow universities to be devastated in this way, partly for ideological reasons, I suspect, they will be, it will certainly rebound, because the universities will not be able to play the role that they do in Germany and elsewhere in connecting with manufacturing, providing the workforce for future manufacturing, and providing the research input that is needed to develop the products that are going to be generated by the industries of the future. We won't nominate all of those today, but there are clearly some that come to mind around renewable energy, med tech, mining equipment for that matter, in which Australia has tremendous competitive advantage, electronics and defence and so on. These are areas that are needed to be assessed and discussed in the context of a foresight exercise. Requires a bit of work by bureaucrats, requires a new type of bureaucrat to administer it, and we're a long way from that at the moment, but this is a start for our discussion. Thanks, Shirley.
No, thanks so much for your excellent contributions, Roy. Now I'm going to throw over to Jem, if you're on the line. Yes, I can see you there.
Yeah.
You introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your research and what you found out.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm Gemma. I'm a PhD candidate at the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute in Flinders. And you definitely can't tell from the room, but I'm coming to you from Ghanaland, but specifically the innovation hub that was built in the shell of the Mitsubishi factory after that closed in Tunsley in South Australia, which in and of itself, I think, is quite a good example of industry policy in action. But we're on a tight schedule, so I'm going to keep to my own points, which is that today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we might be able to glean from the closure of auto manufacturing in Australia. So my research has involved following a cohort of former Holden and supply chain workers from South Australia as they looked for new work after the industry closed. And part of what I've spoken to them, and as part of that, I've been talking to them at length about car making. And a lot of those conversations echo the goals of Curtin's White Paper. Being asked to speak today prompted me to read the full paper, and I might be showing my age a little bit by being slightly surprised by how much it stands up. If we dropped the wartime references and replaced enterprise with innovation, printed it in a sans serif font, I'd be pretty convinced I was looking at one of the more ambitious and contemporary policy documents going today. But one of the clear kind of takeaways from that document and from my research that I want to talk about is the social value of employment. And I suspect I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm going to sing anyway about car making. So I think one of the things that can get lost in a lot of conversations about manufacturing that I think is very important to keep front of mind is the incredible cultural value of the actual work of manufacturing, and conversely, what the paper quite brilliantly refers to as the waste of unemployment. I'm going to guess that most here are relatively familiar, but just in case, Holden was 20 k's north of Adelaide in the city of Playford. Playford is the most disadvantaged local government in the Greater Adelaide region and one of the most disadvantaged urban areas in Australia. They produced their first car in '62, and it was one of the main employers for generations of mostly male workers. Though it is important to mention that at the time of closure, I think almost a quarter of workers spoke an English, a language other than English rather. It was a big part of people's lives, and significantly not just the lives of the people who worked in the factories. And so the loss of car making is a social loss, as well as a very significant blow to our advanced manufacturing sector. And a reoccurring sentiment across many of the conversations I've had with former workers is how much they really loved working in auto manufacturing, or if they didn't quite love it, how satisfied they were with the work. This doesn't mean there weren't complaints or they weren't subject to some of the same doldrums that come from working at the same place and in the same industry for a really long time. And we know that many of them did work there for a long time. But their workplaces, both Holden and the supply chain, were reoccurringly likened to as family. And unsurprisingly, that means many of the workers who left the industry experience a period of grieving, and some still are, for the loss of that camaraderie and support. We know much of this from research into earlier closures, but I think it's significant in a couple of other ways in regards to what we're talking about today. First is that I think speaking plainly about what a good job can mean and has meant has the potential to be a powerful political motivator. But also because there is a broad tendency to conceptualize a lot of manufacturing work as unskilled and therefore unfulfilling, and that's not at all reflected in my research. Participants talk to me about feeling proud seeing a car they know they would have worked on the road. And I mean, it's also pretty rare to hear people say that they loved their work. And a lot of that love can be attributed to the security of a job for life and the sense of being something bigger and specifically making something. Of course, we need to be advocating to change that across the labour force to eliminate inauthentic and insecure work whenever we can, but it's worth remembering. Now, specifically, my work is focused on transition programs, and the goal of full employment would be a transition program of sorts, I think. What we do know about the closure of the auto industry is that the transition was far from full employment and much further still from secure full employment. In terms of lessons learnt, for workers I've spoken to, a lot of the effectiveness of a transition program can either positively or negatively be attributed to the transition program staff. In a lot of the really beautiful stories of effective transition, it's common for transition staff to be mentioned by name and for people to feel kind of disappointed they don't have a reason to talk to them anymore. Whereas on the other side, problems occurred when workers bump up against transition staff who do not fully appreciate the context they were coming from and who they perceived as being inadequately sympathetic to the loss they were feeling, or who they felt were trying to minimise their work experience. An example of this is a worker who went to a job provider and he was told he needed to change his resume because it was disadvantageous for him to have worked at the same place and in the same role for so long. This understandably hurt his feelings, but on a kind of in a broader spectrum, this can lead to a complete disengagement with the program. I think this highlights the importance of attentive, understanding and well-trained employment services, which frankly, thanks to outsourcing, we know is not true of the bulk of job providers at the moment. We need employment programs that are incentivised to find suitable, secure and ongoing work, and that offer genuine retraining opportunities when they're required. If a country knows what it makes, we are sorely lacking. Manufacturing work is important and skilled work, and we need to treat it as such, both for those who are in the industry already and for those, and if we're going to make it an attractive option going forward. And just extremely quickly, I want to, in terms of looking to the future, one of the problems with trialling new technologies and processes is a very understandable concern about negatively disrupting current systems. Whether we're calling it enterprise or innovation, new ideas can be risky. And one of the things Flinders is doing here at Tonsley is working on the establishment of an industrial scale factory of the future facility that will essentially act as a sandpit for manufacturers to try on new technology processes in order to grow advanced manufacturing here in South Australia. That's it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Shem. Now I'll quickly, well, I say quickly, but I'll try and throw to Andrew for a quick comment. Andrew Dedman, National President of the AMW, a great friend and comrade of mine. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome him here.
Thanks very much. Am I coming through okay? Good, thank you. Of course, sharing a platform with Roy Green, it's very difficult to find anything to disagree with about. But I do think that some of the things which Roy has spoken about should be amplified and which we should be talking about in the context of manufacturing. you wouldn't be surprised to know that as the National President of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, that I have a very, very keen interest in manufacturing. And I come from a long line of manufacturing workers myself. And really, it's an industry broadly defined in which I have a great personal stake, as well as a stake for my union and the members that we represent. Manufacturing at the moment is in crisis. There's no way of gilding that lily. We have less than 900,000 people working in manufacturing, broadly defined. The biggest single sector is food. And even that is under threat because of the absence of proper policies which will encourage manufacturing in that sector in years to come. The virus, of course, has brought into stark contrast what the issues are in manufacturing. We don't produce enough. With less than 7%, in fact, it seems to be, on current indications, perhaps even less than 6% of Australia's workforce working in manufacturing. It's no longer the powerhouse that it was, that powered our post-war recovery and was a major reason why the Full Employment White Paper was such a great success. Manufacturing in Australia built and built and built over that 30 years of almost unequal development, where wages and salaries grew significantly, GDP by 2 and 3% per year, and unemployment rarely rose even close to 3%. In fact, some of us can recall when Whitlam was in power, the great scandal that ensued because unemployment actually reached 100,000 people. Manufacturing needs, just as a case in point, for the next in the next 8 years, needs 300,000 more trained workers. We really are behind the 8 ball because of the decay and decline in especially TAFE, but also in skills training in general. The problem that we have is that many of our employers and even more of our private training organisations, you won't be surprised to know, believe that that the way to salvation lies in having a whole lot of people working on, or at least being trained in, micro-credentials. And micro-credentials are courses that could be done in 20 minutes or an hour. They don't actually provide capacity to do the whole job. They don't even provide you with the understanding to enable there to be a capacity on the part of that worker to understand the job itself that they're performing. And even though they can be of use to people who already have a significant skill level themselves, like a tradesperson who might add by way of a type course or a technician likewise, they are really being seen as salvation, which they most markedly are not. The thing which we really need to focus upon is skilled workers at the trade, post-trade, technician, engineering level, etc. Manufacturing cannot survive without skilled workers. We have a very high number of skilled jobs that need to be fulfilled, and the only way we can get them is by ramping up our engagement with the skills area. In TAFE, unfortunately, we have a situation now where we have the federal government saying, and Scott Morrison said the other day, "Oh, we provide $1.5 billion." What he didn't mention, in fact, was that the $2.7 billion has been taken out of that budget in the last few years, and so, or at least under the watch of the Liberal and National Party. So, really, the situation for skills and skill formations, particularly in manufacturing, is quite dire. I have to say that part of the process that we have to engage in here is demystification. We also have to create some connections between those people who see manufacturing as their future, or intrinsically linked to the future of this country. So there's the personal and the national, which are involved. But we also have to make that connection to ensure that it's seen as not some highfalutin idea of policy, which is difficult to understand, but in fact is quite simple. The thing is that what we need is that a whole range of businesses to deal with those and sign up to the issues that Roy has indicated. So we need to reshore manufacturing in this country. We need to bring manufacturing into the 21st century in this country. We have the concept of Industry 4.0, on which I represent our union on what used to be the Prime Minister's task force. Scott Morrison defunded it about 18 months ago. That process is about trying to introduce cyber-physical systems into Australian industry. We're not actually investing in seeing any investment in that. Hopefully, the manufacturing task force, which Roy alluded to, will come out with some proposals which provide some markers and some forward thinking in that. But the problem that we have is that in Australia, the technologies of Industry 4.0, cyber-physical systems, etc., are really only seen as useful by 40% of Australian manufacturers. So there's 60% of Australian manufacturers who don't even see the need for the new technologies which are part of it. And of course, of that 40%, that's just simply the survey results which show that some people believe that it should be done. Of course, there's far fewer that actually have implemented or are implementing the technologies of Industry 4.0. And we need to adapt and adopt the needs for digital manufacturing. We need to be endorsing that, because this is the only way that we will have a viable economy going into the future. The digital economy isn't just a matter of robots telling us what to do. It's not the dystopia of Amazon, where Jeff Bezos makes his billions and where robots are telling workers what to do, and employees are replaced by them as soon as they can possibly be done so. We need to see the skills of digital twinning, of the capacity to manipulate cyber-physical systems, and also, most importantly, the cognitive skills which go to make those skills up, being part of the matrix of skills that are created in Australia and which people are trained in. For us, I think that has quite an exciting element to it, because really we need to see that done promptly. I see that there's only 50 seconds left. I'll conclude, I suppose, by saying that part of what we want is a fair share for manufacturing in Australia, and otherwise we won't succeed.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone. So sorry we've run out of time so quickly. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. I've thrown up all our details here. Please feel free to find us on Twitter. We're all active on Twitter. Feel free to message me during the rest of the conference if you have any questions, and I'll try and crowdsource some answers. But thank you so much for coming, and I really look forward to hearing any other questions that people might have. But we're about to head back into the main room, where we'll have another plenary session. So like I say, plenty of time to message me some questions. Thanks so much for everyone for tuning in. And thanks to all our panelists.